Salerno Podcast, episode 71. As always, I'm your host, Vince Salerno. This is a special podcast because we have a special guest. This week, we have on the podcast Eve Rosemary, the host of the Everyday Saint podcast. She's a good friend of mine who has started this great podcast talking to college students and sharing their testimonies about how they are living out their Catholic faith every day and striving for sainthood in their own little ways. We talk about a lot of stuff in this podcast. Eve is not really someone who talks about the culture in the way that I do and others do, but it's something that is on her mind, and she is of the today's young college generation, and so I thought it would be interesting to get her take on what she sees going on in the world today, especially from a young perspective. So we talk a lot about the culture. We talk a lot about the Catholic Church and our faith. Of course, being that the podcast is called the Everyday Saint podcast, we get into sainthood. We get into heroes and the lack of strong role models in our entertainment. And for the past 5-10 years, we've been devoid of heroes that encompass what heroism truly is. And if even movies and television have a place in our youth's future, they're all on social media, which is having all sorts of effects, both positive and negative, on our culture. And it was a very interesting conversation. Eve's a very intelligent person, and she has, again, a very unique perspective on these things, even if she doesn't predominantly talk about these things. So it was great fun having her. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys enjoy this conversation as well. Again, if you want to subscribe to her podcast, it's the Everyday Saint podcast. I highly recommend you do, especially after listening to this interview, because hopefully it will pique your interest in her podcast. So without further ado, enjoy my interview with Eve Rosemary. Today, we have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Eve Rosemary. Eve is a junior at Benedictine College, studying theology, which inspired her to start the Everyday Saint podcast, where young Catholics inspire young Catholics. She has expanded her podcast into a public speaking ministry where she speaks nationally about the virtue of chastity. Eve, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about your background, where you came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up going to a Catholic school my whole entire life, but it wasn't really until my sophomore and junior year where I started taking my faith a little bit more seriously. And actually that was kind of my first introduction to the realm of social media evangelization, where I started my own TikTok account talking about my faith and trying to inspire others. And I think I got up to about 90,000 followers on that TikTok account. And then it kind of filtered out a little bit more, and I realized that I was spending way too much time on TikTok. So I kind of had a little self-awareness, and then I ended up finding a really great Catholic college at Benedictine College, where I'm studying theology, as you said, in hopes of becoming a Catholic public speaker, which I've already kind of begun with my podcast, which was kind of the root of why I started the podcast, was in the hopes of getting involved with Catholic public speaking, especially on the virtue of chastity as a young person. Was something that I've always been drawn to. And so I began the podcast as a way to help inspire others. So I bring on young people in the faith. So my peers at college, I'll bring onto my podcast to interview them, to talk about their faith, which is a really unique experience because it's meant to inspire other young Catholics to see that there's other people just like them also involved in the faith life, and that they're not alone in that journey.
Awesome. I love it. So yeah, where did the idea for the podcast start?
I was at a coffee shop with my friend, and I was telling her about how I really want to do chastity public speaking. And she mentioned that I was thinking of taking, a year or two and really diving deep into studying that topic so that I'd be very prepared when I wanted to start actually speaking on the topic. And she mentioned that it'd be better for me to start trying to build up something before I got to that point where I was ready to go out and speak, like while researching, starting to build up and getting practice for doing some sort of public speaking. And so that's where I was like, oh, maybe I could have a podcast. But I didn't really want to do a podcast where I sat in front of my screen and just talked to myself for an hour.
Right.
And trying to find topics for that. And then I was thinking about how much I love listening to podcasts, and I love listening to interview podcasts. But a lot of times they're interviews with older people who are well established in their career and seem to know what they're doing with their life. And I was like, that's not me. Like, that's not most people that I know my age. And so then I kind of thought to myself, what if I had an interview podcast where I brought on relatable young Catholics onto the podcast to talk about their faith, share their testimony, different prayers that they really enjoy doing, and the sacraments that they really enjoy and devotions that they have, so that other young Catholics can listen onto that podcast and see examples of people who are just like them experiencing the faith life. Because I know even when I was in high school, I felt like I was the only person actually involved in my faith. Like at my Catholic school, I was known as the Jesus girl who, was actually expressing her faith, which seems kind of backwards, but I didn't know anybody else like me really wanting to know who God was and know his heart and then express that to other people. And so then I thought, this podcast is a great opportunity for other people to kind of know that they're not alone in their faith journey and that there's other young people that are out there trying to do the exact same thing that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's unique about your show is that it is the young college demographic. It's not, as you said, it's not established people who've figured out the secret to life. It's young people who are in the midst of trying to figure it out. And I think, I'm well past college age. I'm 27 years old. I'm probably not even really your target audience. But I've subscribed to the show. I've listened to multiple episodes, and I have to say, as a young adult, I find it inspiring to see just how many young people are starved for wanting to find deeper meaning and deeper purpose in their lives beyond just themselves, and finding it in God and in Jesus Christ. For those who don't know, I'm Catholic. I'm sure, as you've discovered by now, Eve's Catholic, so we're both in good company. I'm curious. You mentioned chastity, and as Catholics, we both know the importance of chastity in the Catholic Church, and just as a moral pillar of living a good life. What specifically stood out to you for wanting to specifically tackle chastity and talk about chastity?
Yes, it's actually been a virtue that I have been drawn to in a way since high school. I remember I had a sophomore theology class, and that theology class in particular, that teacher was my confirmation sponsor. She was just an incredible woman. And I remember part of that curriculum was us talking about theology of the body and the virtue of chastity. And right when she started talking about that and the sexual revolution, I was immediately like, there's something more here than my peers realize. Like, there's something more to this virtue than it's just something that Catholics do. It's just that's such a traditional, old school thing. This is something that's actually relevant and something that we can look to for guidance, and something that's actually really healthy to practice, even if you're not Catholic. It's something that they've done studies on it that, it benefits the health of a marriage. It benefits your own mental health by practicing the virtue of chastity. And so I remember from high school, that sophomore year, I was always drawn to this virtue, and something, as I was looking into going into relationships, it's something that I would always bring up and something that I always made clear. And that obviously provided some challenges in high school because not many other people were also wanting to practice that virtue. And then coming into college, it was just a topic that I kind of reflected on a lot, and being able to go to a Catholic university too. Everybody around me is in really healthy, long-lasting relationships that are all also practicing this virtue. And it's incredible to see because at college, I get to see so many couples, so many Catholic couples who are practicing this virtue, and I can just see the love that they have between each other. And for me, that's really inspirational because it's like they're so in love with each other solely because of the fact that they love who one another is, not because they're, emotionally connected to each other or physically connected to each other. They just really, really love each other before they've even entered into the sacrament of marriage. And obviously, as Catholics, we view that sacrament a little bit more highly than the secular world tends to, because we view it as a covenant and as a sacrament versus more of a, a law or something that's just not a covenant. It's not a sacrament like we celebrate in the Catholic Church, which is something that we take very seriously. And so then, especially being a young Catholic talking about this topic, anytime I've talked about it, you kind of expect like, oh, chastity public speaker, and then, you see like this older gentleman or this older woman walk in, or, you think about your CCD classes where they're like, yeah, it's so important. You're like, okay, but why? And then being able to be someone who's on the younger side, going out and speaking on it, it helps provide an example and get across the message that this is something that young people can practice, and it's not a virtue that's just gone away or something that's old school.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. It really is, as you said, it's a covenant. It's not just something that people think like, oh, that's what priests do. That's what lay people do. It's really does build a healthy foundation, and it I think perfects your desire for relationships, because as you said, a lot of relationships are built on the physical and emotional needs of individuals, and when you try to look past that, not that that's not important. I mean, for any relationship, you have to have at least a physical and emotional attraction as far as a base level goes, but that can be disordered. And when you look for a relationship for the specific purpose of like, I'm trying to find a wife or a husband, the search becomes a lot easier, and I think you find better people. I think a lot of people are kind of lost in that regard because they don't know what it is to look for a good relationship, and they don't have any morals, and as you said, they don't have chastity. So
yeah, exactly.
And
it's hard to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you were going to say.
Oh, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think I was going to say something about that virtue, like not practicing that virtue leads often to unhealthy relationships, or you see someone who's in an unhealthy relationship that they can't get out of it because they are emotionally or physically connected to each other because they're not practicing that. So being able to, put that into practice and see that you're not left kind of with this empty feeling because you're trying to fulfill something that's only meant to be in the context of marriage.
Yeah. And especially when relationships are like, people don't date for marriage. They date because they want to date a lot of people and have fun. Well, that's not what dating's about. We should really bring back courtship and not dating, at least in the modern sense.
Yes, exactly. And I think that ties in a lot with our faith too, of, people are just searching to be loved. And that's a really unhealthy way to look at a relationship, as something to receive something from. Like, a relationship is really meant for you to completely give of yourself. And you can't do that if you're only dating just to date or just for fun. That's kind of a disordered way of looking at dating, because dating is meant for marriage. And if you're not dating for marriage, you're basically just dating for heartbreak, because you're just spending all this time and getting to know this person without the expectation that anything's going to come for it and from it. And you're kind of both wasting your time and using each other, because all you're looking for is someone to affirm the things that you're insecure about, versus looking at that person and wanting to give all that you are and all that you have for that person, and then eventually, hopefully, enter into the sacrament of marriage.
Right, right. And I mean, speaking as a married person, that's when all that really comes to, that's when it's most important to practice that, because you learn very quickly to, when you give yourself to someone for their happiness, for their survival, or however you want to put it, as far as marriage goes, you trust your happiness to that other person. So a lot of people are wanting, like, oh, I want to be with this person because, they make me happy, and that's good. But you have to trust that you have to trust in them and give them the duty of providing, emotionally for you and filling you with joy, while your goal is to do the same thing for your partner. And at least that's what I found,
Right.
in my marriage, that, we entrust, we make each other happy because, we love each other. And I don't expect, my wife to, jump over hoops for me, because I trust that she's going to do what is sufficient for our marriage, and she trusts me that, I'm going to do what's sufficient for our marriage. And when you have such a deep level of trust like that in a relationship and or a marriage, that's where the joy comes out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's no wonder that so many marriages are ending in divorce, because I mean, we have such a high divorce rate now because people are looking at relationships and marriage as something to just be fulfilled by, versus something that challenges you to be a better person, because you're constantly wanting to be a better person for the person that you're married to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, marriage is not easy, but it's definitely more rewarding when you have the right mindset going into it.
Right. And I mean, I think that's why Catholics view it as a vocation too, and not just something that you do. And that's why it's a sacrament, because it's a covenant between you and you promising to be a better person for that person and live your life of sacrificing yourself for the good of that person.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, folks. We had a little technical difficulty there, but we're back. Devil's trying to shut down the stream, but not today, Satan. All right. So shifting from that topic, this podcast is predominantly, about movies and entertainment, talking about the industry, but it's also about talking about the culture and the things that have contributed to our declining culture, whether that's politics, the type of entertainment that's being produced, the people producing it, and just how that's affected this country as a whole. So, in your specific opinion, what is your response or take on the current state of our culture?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question a little bit before we hopped on, because it's not something, I don't know if I talk about it quite as often on my podcast, but I kind of look at our culture and I see a lot of anger within our culture. And as someone, that I don't like conflict a lot, so that's something that, like, I picked up on pretty consistently. And it's kind of this anger of, not just like with the culture, like people kind of grumble and, will say what they say about things that happen, and can be angry with that. But I also see a lot of anger within ourselves. Like, we're looking at a society that, is angry at themselves and tries to avoid that anger by scrolling on social media for hours, or overcompensating by, you start reaching for your comfort movie and a bag of chips because you're feeling overwhelmed or overstimulated. And I think a lot of that just comes from this, like, I don't know what to do with the emotions that I'm feeling. And so we start turning to a lot of other things and seeking that comfort that we can't seem to find within our culture, because we're constantly overstimulating ourselves and saying yes to so many things that we forget that saying no to something is saying yes to something greater. And as a result, we kind of end up becoming insecure or overwhelmed, or, we look to our friends or other people in our life for affirmation versus trying to get to the root of what we're angry at within ourselves, and then taking that out on other people.
Mhm. Wow, that's powerful. I think that's that's very. Yeah, I think you're on the nose there. I definitely feel like a lot of people have been in that for a while now because our culture does not promote and produce the best in us anymore.
Mm-hmm.
At work, I've been working on a particular project talking about our heroes and why the culture is not producing, the entertainment industry specifically is not producing heroes. Like, you think about great American heroes who like encompassed the ideals that this country was built on, and just good morals at the end of the day. I mean, I'm a guy, so I'm sure my perspective will be somewhat limited. But I think of like John Wayne. I think of that original Superman movie with Christopher Reeves. I think of Luke Skywalker. I think of Rocky Balboa. Like, these are characters who, at their core, represented a taking on a higher purpose that was beyond their particular wants and needs. And they represent American ideals and just striving for goodness and striving for greatness, and sometimes at the sacrifice of your own personal wants, your own personal desires. And I think you're right. Like, people wanting to self-medicate and not avoid the problems in their lives, as opposed to actually. And it's hard. It's hard to look at yourself in a mirror, because I think we're all kind of programmed to not like ourselves in a way. Like, all of us, to a degree, are kind of dissatisfied with who we are. And as opposed to actually do the hard work and fix ourselves, we'd rather self-medicate, turn to either addictions or substances that aren't going to solve the problem, or retreat into movies, which is not a bad thing to say, but that is also to say that, the movies that are being made today in modern culture are not the types of things that are like, hey, get off your couch right now and fix your life because these characters in these movies did that and you can too.
I was just thinking about the heroes topic that you were saying, and how they're not making kind of heroes in the way that they were, and in a way of like, oh, you want to go and be that person. And I was thinking about, there's like the little clip going around of the actress who's going to play Snow White in the live action remake, where she says, I don't know much about the topic personally, but I've just seen this one clip where it's like, well, I'm just saying it's not 1937 anymore, is what she says about the movie, and how they're changing Snow White for this live action side of things. And all these like responses to it is like, well, what makes what Snow White did in the original movie a bad thing? Or, as a little girl, I watched Snow White, and it's like, I wanted to be like Snow White. So does that make me bad? Or going back to what we were talking about, she got to this cottage and she starts cooking and cleaning and trying to take care of the dwarfs. And that is, the natural feminine instinct as well, is to try and take care of people and to nurture. And that's not a bad thing either. Like, we should want to be the person that goes to a stranger's home and sees that it's messy and tries to help in any way that we can. That's not a bad thing to do. Yeah. So it's also changing a narrative that, the ideals that we used to look up to aren't good ideals to look up to anymore, because our world has changed. And it has changed, but that doesn't mean that those things are also bad. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot with that Snow White movie. First off, there aren't 7 dwarves. There's 7 random magical creatures of every race, gender, and whatever you want to throw in there. Snow White's being played by Rachel Zegler, who I believe is Filipino or Mexican. I don't know for sure. But she played Maria in the West Side Story remake. And before this whole situation, I thought Rachel Zegler, great actress. She did a good job. I'm a huge West Side Story fan, so I was already going to be overcritical of any attempt to remake that movie. And I thought she did a good job. And then this comes out and it's like, well, can't have nice things. And unfortunately, yeah, you're getting a peek into her soul in a way. And it's like, this is how she feels about things like Snow White. I believe in the movie she described as being like, the fairest and truest woman or female in all the land. I haven't seen the movie in forever, so I don't know. But she had a nobility and this quality to her that made the queen jealous, which is why she went to the lengths to poison her with the apple. And yeah, the fact that we have people in Hollywood who think like that's wrong. We need to have Snow White be a feminist girl boss who, it has to be a leader, a strong leader, and taking on like male qualities because the patriarchy. I had a Helen Roy on the podcast about a month ago, I think, and we were talking about how, that particular type of feminism is destroying Hollywood, destroying what it means to be a woman, and the ideal version of what it means to be a woman and feminine. So I'm actually curious. I asked her this question. I want to ask you the same thing. Do you think we need to take back the term feminism and return it to its former roots, or do you think it's something that we just need to abandon because it's been so hijacked by these activists?
Ooh, it's a good question. I don't know if it's something that we need to abandon in its sense, because it started out as something that was good, like having the right to vote and different things like that. But it definitely has been taken to an extreme. And, there was a point where I considered myself a feminist, but not in the sense that it means today. It's just that, I'm a woman who wants to embrace authentic femininity. And I mean, I don't think we can get rid of that term in general because, that's what we use to kind of establish and distinguish, I guess, what the initial feminists were trying to do. Even then, they weren't, for the topics that feminists are today, they wouldn't have supported those topics at all. I've read a little bit of The Genesis of Gender by Abigail. I can't quite remember her last name, but I remember listening to her. She was on a podcast that I listened to, and she was saying that the initial roots of feminism were not at all what we have today and what we see today. So I'd like to say that we don't have to abandon the term and what we had initially worked for in that very initial fight, but it's definitely become kind of this monster in a way of trying to strive for a freedom that is free of consequences, and that's not what feminism should be. It should be trying to embrace our natural inclinations as women and being able to see ourselves as something that is beautiful and that should be celebrated. I mean, that's what feminism should be. It should be a celebration of women versus trying to celebrate getting rid of all consequences and embracing more of a freedom, but a false sense of freedom because there's no rules, quote unquote, but that's really not what it's meant to be.
I find it ironic that feminists want to destroy masculinity, but they want to promote feminism, but their version of feminism is just masculinity, but with females. And
exactly, yeah.
It's diminishing to I think both genders, like women, at least modern feminists, denying their essence and envying that of men and wanting to destroy men and take it over, basically, as opposed to just embracing. I mean, I'm not I'm not an expert on these things, so I'm not lecturing or saying what's true or not true, but just living who you are. If you're a man, be masculine. If you're a woman, be feminine. We shouldn't deny these inherent parts of our being.
Absolutely. And I even remember going back to when I was an education major, we had a class, and one of the topics that we discussed in that class, when it comes to students, it wasn't obviously directly on the feminist movement or anything, but I remember a lesson that we had was equity versus equality, and you shouldn't treat each student equally because that's not what they all need. There might be one student that moves very quickly in a subject and doesn't need all your time and attention. And in fact, if you were to give them all of your time and attention, they'd probably get annoyed and do worse because they don't need all that help. But then there's another student who's struggling with the same with the same thing that you're talking about with this other student who needs a lot more help. And to disregard them and try and provide them with the same amount of attention as a student who's doing really well would be unfair to that student who's struggling. And I think that's kind of how I look at the feminist movement, is that it shouldn't be equality, it should be equity, and giving each part its due respect and its due honor, versus trying to make them the exact same thing, because they're not the exact same thing, and it should be what is most equitable for both parties.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, as we're talking a lot about the culture, we're talking a lot about entertainment stuff. I'm curious, what do you either you specifically or your general generation, as far as entertainment goes, what are you or your generation, what are you guys watching? Are you watching TV shows? Are you watching old shows? Are you watching new shows? Are you watching new movies, old movies? What type of entertainment are you guys consuming?
Ooh, well, this morning I was watching the finale of The Bachelorette. That's just more for my own fun. I'm a reality TV show. That's what I like to watch personally. But I don't know if I know many people, honestly, who would sit down and watch a movie anymore. I think our brains are so rewired to look for the thing that's the fastest and will keep us entertained for the longest amount of time. So I see more people scrolling on social media or watch a movie, and while we're watching the movie, we're scrolling on our phones because we can't focus on one thing for a really long amount of time, is what I'm seeing more of. But I've been addicted. I think I'm at a very sheltered area, and I know that, and I recognize that, where I don't know many people who have TikTok or social media. A lot of us don't own very many social media apps, or the social media apps that I see other people my age having. So it's a little bit different, I think, in the community that I'm in, but I definitely see people rather scrolling other than sitting down and watching something with their friends.
Yeah, I've been guilty of the watching a movie and being on your phone practice. I've actively fought against that for the past year, and even still, it kind of becomes a challenge because, unfortunately, we're so desensitized to have such short attention spans. But that's interesting. I think social media, has kind of become a very quick and digestible remedy in the way that movies used to be, which in a way is kind of sad. I mean, as a filmmaker, that's sad, but
right.
It's funny that that I think we have yet to see I feel like every generation has a movie or something that really captures that generation's imagination and attention, regardless of whether you're into movies in the level that I am, or you're just a casual watcher. I think maybe it was Top Gun Maverick, because I know everybody. I mean, that movie came out almost over a year ago. My wife and I are still, we're still in love with that movie. But I think, and I wonder if it's like you said, the social media that's capturing people's attention and creating these short attention spans, or if it's just the fact that, again, like the heroes in these movies are not what like my generation or past generations have grown up on, and there's nothing to really capture that imagination because either we're not looking for it or it's not being produced.
Right. And I'm curious, something I thought of that I would like to ask you is I see in our society like it not being quite as creative. And I know you're a creative person very much in the sense of like filmmaking and editing videos. And I'm wondering if, our generation is more focused on finding things that are more relatable and more real versus trying to, jump into this world of a movie because it's not as relatable. So we'd rather scroll on social media and see all like the funny TikToks of people joking about things that we can relate to, or trying to make humor out of it.
Yeah.
Do you think the lack of watching movies is more of we're not being as creative with the movies that we're making, and we don't want to take the extra step to jump into this world and get engrossed by a movie? Or we're going to social media just because of like the short attention spans rather than and like relatable content so that we don't have to like think about things and go to like the creativity and focus on something for a long amount of time?
Yeah. Well, I think movies can be a healthy escape. I mean, we all need to escape from reality every once in a while. But the difference between what was being produced back in like the 1980s, which is like my favorite decade of cinema, and now is that the heroes and the people you watch on films were actually inspiring people and actually kind of like, if you have a rough day or you're going through some sort of crisis in your life, you used to be able to watch a movie from that period, or most movies, I'd say, from that period, and either just have a laugh or watch, me specifically, like I'm a huge nerd. I talk a lot about heroes and stuff because I like heroes and I like what they inspire for the culture. And my goal as a filmmaker is to eventually, as Hollywood is not producing heroes, I want to create new heroes that will inspire the next generation the way that the heroes of like the 80s and 90s inspired me. And so I think we just don't have individuals or characters that inspire the best in people. Like last week, I just talked about how Daisy Ridley's character from Star Wars, Rey, she's not, she doesn't go through anything that Luke Skywalker goes through as far as achievements, because she's this character that is built to be already good at everything. She doesn't lose anything. She doesn't sacrifice anything. She doesn't come to some greater calling or make a like noble sacrifice. Whereas you have Luke Skywalker, who was this like hyper idealistic kid who just wanted to, join the rebellion and become a Jedi and swing a laser sword. And then all of a sudden he realized that in order to do that, he has to sacrifice the one thing he cares about the most. And that is being with his friends. So he chooses, and over time he chooses, I have to separate myself from the people I care about the most in order to protect them, even if it means that I may never see them again. And like, that's a noble thing, choosing the greater good and the greater good of the people you love over what you want. And I think we're starved for stuff like that. We're starved for content that actually, again, inspires the best in us. And yeah, you're having a good day, but you can watch Luke Skywalker and think, wow, if he can overcome the odds, so can I. And as far as the social media comment, I do think it's, I think the short tension spans, again, do contribute. I think the younger generation has not been built and bred to take on the hardships of reality. And that is setting them up for, I mean, you know, high depression rates, high anxiety rates, and, you know, sadly, high suicide rates, because people are like, I just had a friend of mine who's a nurse. We were talking over the weekend. She said, like, a lot of people that she sees are self-diagnosing themselves with anxiety or depression because they're just, and it's not even that they actually have anxiety or depression. I mean, some of them do, but the vast majority are just too scared or too afraid to take on the world and do what they're called to do. And I think it's partly just a matter of pulling up your bootstraps, knowing that God has your back, and getting out in the world and doing what you're called to do. And I think if we had heroes who, this is all coming full circle now, people are retreating into social media, which is causing them greater anxiety and fear because they don't know how to handle their problems. And we also don't have heroes, whether actually in this world, in our politics and all that, or in our culture and our movies, that are inspiring the best in us. And I think if we can get people in there who will inspire the best in us, that will have a significant impact on the world. I mean, you know, you look at, like, you know, people saw Top Gun and they're like, little boys or little girls, they're like, oh, I want to be a fighter pilot one day. I want to serve my country. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I want to see in this country. People watching and being inspired by either real life heroes or fictional heroes and thinking, like, I want to be like that person because they inspire the best in me. And even if you can't find, and, you know, as Catholics, even if you can't find that in this world or in fiction, of course, we can always turn to the saints. But, you know, if you're not Catholic, then you're not really looking towards the saints, unfortunately.
Right. And even then, looking at movies and trying to find movies that you won't feel like you have to go to confession after watching it.
Oh my gosh,
it's something that I've struggled with. Or even looking for TV shows. Like, I mean, I'm guilty of, I'll do like a coloring book or something, and I want to put on a show while I'm doing my coloring book or painting or doing something like that and being creative. But trying to find like a good show, like, it's such a struggle. There's so many shows that I'll go on my Netflix and it's like, continue watching, because I get through one episode and it's like, this either isn't a good show, or I feel like I can't feel right about watching it. And that's, I mean, maybe that's part of the reason I don't quite watch as many movies or TV shows, is just because you can't find any that I feel morally right about watching.
Yeah, you don't know what to trust. I totally relate to that. I think even being a dad has made me more sensitive to that, because I used to have a very nonchalant and just anything goes attitude when it comes to watching movies and stuff. And then I think just one day I was just like, I don't like what I've been putting in my head. I think I need to be more sensitive to stuff. So now I'm going on like IMDb and looking at the parental guides for watching a movie, making sure, like, you know, what's the level of violence in this? What's the level of nudity and sexual material in this? And just like, nope, don't even want to go there. I think I avoided seeing Oppenheimer because I heard there was some sort of gratuitous sex scene in there. As much as I love Christopher Nolan and want to see the movie, I thought, you know, I don't need to put that in my mind. I'll get the VidAngel version when it comes out. So how do you so as getting to the podcast, the Everyday Saint podcast, or is it Everyday Saint or Everyday Saints?
Saint, not
Saint.
plural.
Got it. Okay. Got it. How has the podcast affected you and your community? Because you're doing this at Benedictine. You're predominantly interviewing Benedictine students. So how do you think this has had an effect on that community and on you as well?
Right. I guess I don't know if I can speak quite as much as on the community side of things, but for me, I have really enjoyed it, because even I remember my freshman year getting to Benedictine, and I looked around. Benedictine made me a better Catholic, because I saw so many people around me actually striving to be holy and striving for sainthood. And I would tell people when I get home from breaks, I was like, I have no doubt that where I'm at college, I am going to school and I am being taught by people who will be saints someday. And so then, coming on to this podcast, I actually get to have conversations with people that, I somewhat know, or I've had a class with them before, but I don't actually know their story. And so being able to hear them talk about their faith, I mean, there's 2,000 students here, and each one of those students has a story that deserves to be told, and that people need to hear about, especially because, you look at saints' lives, which we are very fortunate that we can look at the lives of saints, but so many saints we see, do these like absolutely incredible things. And then it's like, well, how can I be that way? Or, you look at St. Augustine, who had all of a sudden like this huge turnaround of his life and this incredible testimony. And then I hear people at Benedictine say, well, it's like, well, I grew up a creative Catholic, or I grew up going to Mass, and that's kind of my story, and that's how I got involved in the faith. But that in itself is a story that deserves to be told, and that people can actually relate to, that, I don't have to have this crazy testimony of where I was involved in all of these terrible things, and then all of a sudden Jesus appeared to me himself in my bedroom one night, and, all this stuff happened. Like, that does happen maybe for some people, but most of the time that's not actually what happens. And so then having like these examples of like, okay, there is something so incredible about the little stories in life. That's kind of why it's the everyday saint. It's someone that you see walking around on the street. It's like your cashier at your grocery store, that each one of them has a story that deserves to be told, and a story that really means something someday, because there's going to be a day where we're at the gates of heaven, and, we're going, like, that decides our eternity. And God isn't going to look at your story and be like, that wasn't good enough, or like your testimony wasn't strong enough, so you're not going to go into heaven, because he carefully curated that testimony and that story as the best way for you to get to sainthood, and the best way for you to get to him. And so I think going into communities then and seeing kind of like the social media platforms grow, and all of a sudden the podcast starts to get more viewers, it's knowing that whatever is discussed on that podcast is a story and something that someone's going to listen to and be able to relate to, and know that because this person who's on this podcast, who has a really similar background to them, has made a difference in people's lives. It's like, okay, I can be that everyday saint, and I can go out and even though maybe I didn't think that I had a story to tell, I really do have a story to tell and something to share with people.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. It can seem like as like sainthood can be this impossible thing to achieve, but in our own little ways, we can strive for sainthood. It is possible, and to know that God is working in all of our lives in a very specific way that is specific to us. Your story is not the same as my story. My story is not the same as yours. But we're all made and built and bred for the same goal and the same purpose, which is heaven, and then hopefully sainthood as well. So I love that. Right. I love that not simplifying sainthood, but making it just making it digestible in a way that's like, you can do this. We all can do this. We're all made for this.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that's attainable for all of us.
So, last question before we let you go. We've talked a lot about culture. We've talked a lot about the Catholic Church and all that. Kind of distilling all that together. What do you think is necessary for our culture and our society to heal, I guess, from the damage that either I want to say you and me, but like, as a society that, we've caused, other people have caused. How do we heal from this?
Yeah, it might sound cheesy, but this was kind of like the first thing that came to my mind, and that's really just centering ourselves on gratitude. Because even if, that's something that's important to us as Catholics, is being grateful, but it's something that even like no matter where you come from, gratitude is an important part of our lives. And kind of going back to what I was saying about being an angry society, the antidote for anger is gratitude, because you can't be, angry and grateful at the same time. It just doesn't quite work that way. And so combating the things, that we see in our lives with gratitude, or looking for the little things in life, I think being able to combat things and look at problems within our culture and within things that we're experiencing too. If you don't have gratitude, I don't know if you really have anything going for you at that point. So in order to really heal, we have to look at the things that we are grateful for. And I think going from there is really going to be able to cause a fruitful society and being able to solve a lot of the problems that we see in that we want to heal from.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Attitude of gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
One last question I'll squeeze in. What do you believe your mission is?
I think that's something we have to ask ourselves every single day, because it'll change on the daily, but at the root, I think it comes down to being able to serve other people in the best way that you can, and looking for the ways of what your unique talents are. And for me, I love public speaking, and I like being able to, sit down and talk with somebody about what they're going through and being able to be empathetic towards them. So looking at my strengths and seeing how I can make a difference and use those things for good, and not just for myself, but for the benefit of other people.
Fantastic. Well, Eve, thank you so much for being on the show. Again, guys, the podcast is called the Everyday Saint Podcast. And where can people find the podcast? Where can people find you on social media if they want to follow you?
Yes, for the podcast, it's available wherever you listen to podcasts as the Everyday Saint, and then the name would be under Eve Rosemary. And then on social media, the Instagram you can follow is the Everyday Saint Podcast. You can also learn more of like the public speaking side of my ministry at www.theeverydaysaint.com.
Sweet. Well, we'll link all that in the description of this episode. Eve, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been fun.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
Of course. Again, special thanks to Eve for coming on the show, especially last minute. We put this podcast together very last minute, and she was able to, she was kind enough to take time out of her busy schedule to come on. So great honor. Would love to have her back on whenever she's available. Again, Everyday Saint Podcast. Check it out on Spotify, Apple. I will link her social medias and podcast links in the description of this episode so you guys can check that out. And I want to thank you guys for listening to this episode or watching this episode. If you liked it, hit that like button or subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can check out my short films, trailer reactions, more episodes of the Vince Salerno podcast, plus clips and reels. Again, still working on projects and stuff, so hopefully I'll have some news for that in the coming months, or maybe even next year. We'll see. In the meantime, guys, have a great day or great week. God bless, and peace out.